this is the Panasonic EVA1, a compact cine camera that a lot of people have never heard of, and it's almost 5 years old. So why am I doing a review now of such an old camera? Well, this is the first cinema camera that I ever bought, so I'm kind of fond of it. I bought this camera at a point in my career when I decided to go freelance full time, and so I guess it represents the moment I properly invested in myself as a filmmaker. I've shot in so many types of environments with this camera, from intimate docs, corporate work, broadcast, to being in the thick of things up front at music festivals, and amongst the scrum of ferocious photographers at London Fashion Week, which was one of the most terrifying filming experiences of my life. And I think anyone wanting a cheap step up from a DSLR, especially a LUMIX system, or anyone who's used to shooting in vlog, might find a lot to like in the EVA1. The EVA1 has a 5.7K Super 35 sensor. You know, at the time, in terms of price and specs, it ran up against the popular FS5 or Canon C200. But unlike those cameras, it offered full 4K, 10-bit, 422 filming internally, and it could do that up to 60 frames a second. And it also offered a really impressive range of codecs and frame rates. This was the day before, 10-bit internal recording was standard for DSLRs. So if you wanted that feature, a compact cine camera was really your only route. It was definitely the most I'd ever spent on a piece of equipment. And despite a pandemic and several lockdowns getting in the way, this camera has easily paid itself off, and then some. Even after picking up a RED Komodo earlier in the year, I'm still using the EVA1 regularly, and in the end, I decided not to sell it, and this video is hopefully going to explain why. So some of the things about the EVA1 that I want to talk about in this video are: it's still very impressive image quality, its range of internal codecs and frame rates, which is the thing that allows it to be Netflix approved, its range of professional features like, internal ND filters, XLRs, battery life, all the things that make it great for solo operators and documentary work, lightweight and customizable form factor, and the fact that it can shoot 5.7K RAW, with a very cool party trick that it can also shoot up to 240 frames in RAW. But obviously no camera is perfect. There are things we'll look at that might not make this the best camera for everyone. Some of those things are its lack of autofocus, its frankly awful monitor, and perhaps the fact that it has a EF lens mount, which might be problematic for some people. It's generally around this time in a camera's life cycle that people tend to start picking them up pre-owned. So, I had a little look around and I saw that used EVAs are going for around 2.5 to 3.5 grand. And I think at that price, you're getting a really good deal, considering you're getting a camera that can still produce a fantastic image. It's packed full of professional features. It's super compact and lightweight, and it's also Netflix approved if you care about that. You can record 4K up to 60 frames a second in 10-bit, and you can also get full sensor readout 6K RAW with an external recorder, but we'll look at that a bit later. As it's a 5.7K sensor, when you shoot in either 4K or 1080p, you're getting a very excellent downscale, downsampled image. It provides a lot of detail, a lot of color information. The EVA1 also shares the same color science with the larger VeriCam cinema cameras from Panasonic. So you just get this really gorgeous 10-bit 422 image to work with in post, and from my experience, it just looks beautiful and doesn't require a ton of work, so long as you've exposed it properly and all that. I've always just really enjoyed working with the EVA image in post. Even when I'm shooting alongside the Komodo, I get the EVA footage in, and I'm always pleasantly surprised of how well it stacks up against this newer camera. I really love how this camera renders colors, and especially skin tones. I've been able to push very clean, slick and sharp images from this camera, but have also learned how to push a much more grungier, more organic image as well. I guess straight out the camera it is maybe a little bit too clean and sharp, but there's loads of things you can do to soften that up, whether that's using filtration like black pro mists, or treating the image in post. I almost always shoot in vlog on this camera. It captures a lot of dynamic range and it has a really lovely highlight roll off. It's basically the reason I've chosen to stay with Panasonic cameras over the years, including picking up the LUMIX S5. I just really love the detail and the organic quality of the image. On 2-cam shoots, when I'm using the LUMIX S5, I tend to stick the EVA1 on the closer shot in interviews because I think it just produces a much nicer close-up shot than the S5, which has a slightly more clinical, harsher image. One thing I have found with Panasonic cameras over the years is that skin tones can come out a little warmer than I like, but that's pretty easy to correct in post by adjusting the saturation of reds and adding green. Panasonic also provides some excellent LUTs to work with. They're VeriCam LUTs. My favourite at the moment is the nicest 709 LUT, as I find this provides an excellent starting point for my grades. Obviously I'll add links to these in the description. I also really use an Alexa conversion LUT produced from this website. It's basically a colour space transform that converts it to an Alexa Rec 709 image. You can tweak the settings and produce your own LUTs if you follow the link. I'll put that in the description down below. You can set that up and download your own LUT for free. In Resolve, I really love using Sir's Film Vision Power Grade to get really beautiful sort of film emulation type looks. That isn't specific to this camera, but I've used it on a lot of EVA footage and it just creates a really lovely grungy film-like look, and it kind of really just takes that digital edge away from the EVA1 and produces some really beautiful results. The EVA1 also has a range of built-in color profiles, so if you don't want to grade a vlog image, you can use one of these presets and you can also tweak them to your liking. You can see the differences between them here. Personally, I usually stick with Scene File 2 for fast turnaround jobs. I really like the image I get out of that. Also, I thought it might just be nice to have a quick look at how the EVA1 stacks up against a more modern Super 35 camera like the Komodo. I'll leave these images up here and you can make your own decisions, but I think they stack up pretty well. It is a dual ISO camera, which means it has 2 native ISOs. It has a low value of 800 and a higher value of 2500. At those values, you'll get the best results, so the cleanest image and the best dynamic range. But honestly, I really recommend experimenting with those. 90% of the time, I try to keep the camera in native mode, which means you just quickly toggle between either 800 ISO or 2500 ISO. I think one thing to note about this camera is that it does have a slightly more pared back approach to dealing with noise. Generally this is a good thing because it expects a more professional workflow. It's a professional camera, so it kind of gives you more information to do the processor intensive noise reduction in post rather than trying to do it within the camera. The EVA1 does have built-in noise reduction options, and these can be set for either ISO level. In my testing, it's best to keep it off, but if you need to use it, then I'd use normal 1 for ISO 800 and normal 1 or normal 2 for ISO 2500. Generally, I'd avoid the smooth option. It's very extreme, and I found it just makes things look a little bit too mushy. So if you really do need aggressive noise reduction, I think you'd be better off applying it in post. This approach to dealing with noise is different for every camera. Other cameras might be more aggressive with the internal noise reduction, and they might appear to produce a cleaner image out of camera, but what's really happening is coming with the cost of detail and sharpness. In instances that I am struggling with noise from this camera, it's generally because I haven't black balanced it in a while, and basically that's just like a sensor calibration, and then that normally sorts out the issues with noise pretty quickly. The EVA1 has a really great range of codecs to choose from. Again, it's another one of its selling points for a camera of its time. If you're shooting for broadcast, then you can put it in the highest quality all intra codec. I think at 4K you're shooting at around 400 megabits per second. For most of my work, if it's not a high profile job, is to shoot in long-op or the HEVC H.265 codec. They're much more efficient in terms of compression whilst retaining plenty of color, detail and data for flexibility in post. One of the selling points of this camera for me was that it could shoot up to 60 frames a second in 4K in an uncropped 10-bit file. Alongside that, it also boasted some really impressive frame rate features as well, especially for cameras of that generation. Internally, you can shoot up to 120 frames a second in a 10-bit 42 file. That's with a slight crop, and it's in HD rather than 4K. But in my experience, this footage is pretty usable if you light it properly. If you need it, the camera can also shoot up to 240 frames a second internally. It's not great in a micro four third crop, and you have to record in an 8-bit 420 quality. Honestly, I rarely find myself needing more than 60 frames a second, and the options that the camera provides for this are fantastic, and this footage grades and looks beautiful. So the EVA1 has an EF lens mount. It is a slightly older lens mount, but you know, there's still loads of those lenses kicking around. One of the lenses that I owned before getting this camera was the Sigma 18-35, and that has been an absolutely stunning lens to use on this camera. So if you are picking up an EVA1, I really recommend pairing it with that lens because it just goes really well and produces some beautiful images. It comes with all the things you'd expect from a compact cine camera, so you know, things like internal ND filters, detachable side grip, a removable top handle, which has, you know, cold shoe mounts and other mounting points. It has a detachable rotating LCD touchscreen. It has two phantom powered XLR inputs. They're not going to win any awards, but generally for web delivery work, they've been fine. Body also comes with several 1/4-inch mounting points, which are super useful for attaching accessories, physical audio dials, alongside a ton of physical buttons and controls for the camera, many of which are user assignable. The camera has a full-size HDMI and SDI ports. You can output 4K signals over those. It has a timecode port, dual SD card slots. There's the option to record to both of those cards simultaneously for redundancy, or you can obviously expand your recording time and record across two cards from one to the next. Another great thing about the EVA1 is that it weighs only around 1.2 kilograms. Now, relative to other cine cameras, especially when it launched, it was super lightweight. Honestly, this was one of the reasons why I went with the EVA1. I worked on a range of jobs when I first picked up this camera, from jobs with small crews to stuff where I was traveling on my own. So I really wanted something that I could pack down and something that I could manage on my own. There is a downside to all of that, and over the years I have found that the camera is almost too light to shoot with. So what I found I've ended up doing a lot more recently, since I've been shooting on the Vespids, is that I have to kind of bulk the camera up. And what I tend to do is I use the sort of base plate for my shoulder rig on the bottom, and then also sometimes rig it out with the handles and then use an easy rig. And I found just having this additional weight attached to the camera just really helps create really lovely stable shots. And I find that sort of works really well for, you know, 75% of the things I'm filming these days, and it also allows me to transition between sort of floaty handheld work and then also very quickly chuck it on my shoulder for shoulder mounted work. The EVA1 also has electronic image stabilization, which is useful in some situations, I'd say. What it basically does is it just crops in a little bit on the sensor and then sort of digitally zooms to try and counteract any camera movement. I used this a lot when I first got it, and in some circumstances it's great, but it did tend to sometimes distort or warp the footage. And in the end, I just sort of lost all confidence in it, and I just don't really use it anymore. For power, I personally use these Core SWX high-capacity batteries, which are a native Panasonic mount. What's great about them is they also come with a D-tap connection in the back, which is perfect for powering a monitor or some other accessory. I find this a fantastic setup, and I have two of these, and they usually get me through the whole day with juice to spare, and that's with powering a monitor as well. The EVA1 has, you know, all the usual great monitoring tools that you'd expect. You know, it's got zebras, it's got waveforms, it's got multiple focus assist features, and then it also has loads of customizable buttons on the body and also on the hand grip. The camera also has a couple of other quirky features, like one of them being you can switch out the IR infrared cut filter. To be honest, I've never really used it. I guess it would open up some fun, creative possibilities. The EVA1 was part of a generation of compact cine cameras that were sort of transitioning away from those electronic viewfinders, EVFs. The problem being with the EVA1 is that its detachable LCD screen, which is what you have to rely on, is generally not very good. It's super reflective and to the point where it's pretty unusable outdoors, even with provided flip out sunshade, which I've lost. You know, inside or in dark locations, you can probably get away with it, it's all right. And you know, the touchscreen does come in handy in terms of making quick adjustments to settings and stuff. But generally, if you are getting this camera, I'd recommend getting an external monitor and then just leaving the LCD attached to display your camera settings for quick review. I tend to use the Sakuto Z Finder, which converts it into a sort of EVF. I think it was around £500 at the time I got it. And I use this on most shoots as I have a preference to shoot shoulder mounted, but obviously you could also pick up a third party EVF or just use an external monitor on a Magic Arm. With the internal NDs, I wish they'd go a bit higher. You know, you get about 6 stops of ND going up to ND 1.8. So when shooting outside on super sunny days, it's just not quite enough. And I find I either have to stop down on the lens or add additional ND. Probably the only side grip of a camera that I've used that I liked is probably the RED Komodo's outrigger handle, and you know, the EVA1 doesn't come close to that. You know, it's not awful, it does provide useful features like recording and changing your iris and other user customizable buttons, but generally it just feels quite like plasticky and a bit delicate. Also, the EVA1 has a sort of push button autofocus mode. It's rubbish, I never use it, so I'm not going to spend any more time talking about it. So combining this camera with an external recorder unlocks its raw recording potential. Honestly, I've never really used this much, as I think the internal recordings are generally pretty good and good enough for most web work. But in the few cases I have used it, it's been really easy to set up and produce really beautiful looking footage with, you know, a lot of flexibility in post. And I think it will really help to extend the life of this camera for those interested in picking it up today. Now at 5.7K you can only record I think up to 30 frames a second, but if you knock it down to 4K then you can get up to 60 frames a second in RAW, which I think is incredible for a camera of this age. And the EVA1's real party trick is that it can record 240 frames a second in RAW in 2K resolution, and it's genuinely really good. So if you're delivering in 1080p or, you know, possibly even using an upscaling program like Topaz, then this is a really powerful feature to have on such an old camera. You can capture this in either ProRes RAW or Blackmagic RAW, B-RAW, whichever flavor is your preferred type of RAW. And if you want to see more detail on how to set this up, you can watch my video on that somewhere here, and the link for that will be in the description down below. So if you want to pick up a cheap and capable compact cine camera in 2023, then the EVA1 is a really promising proposition. You know, you have the fantastic image quality, a very strong and diverse set of recording codecs and frame rates. You have a fantastic log profile to work with, and you know, loads of professional features, all jammed packed into a really lightweight and compact camera body. So, you know, if you're not bothered about owning the latest equipment, then this is a solid buy. You know, there's this concept that just because the camera is 5 years old that it becomes redundant after a certain point, and it doesn't. It doesn't mean you can't produce beautiful and relevant looking pieces of work with it. I think the increases in quality that we've seen in cameras that have come out over the following years, you know, have been fairly incremental in what they can achieve. At the moment, the FX6 or C70, once you've kitted those out, you're going to be looking at spending around 7K, probably more. So if you're willing to sacrifice some of the latest camera features to save a huge sum of money, they might find the EVA1 a really cost-effective option. Or LUMIX users who want to step up from the mirrorless systems, you know, the image of the EVA1 exceeds that of the S5 or the S5 Mark II, and in my opinion is on par with the S1H or BS1H, which, you know, also shares the same battery type as the EVA1. Pairing up one of these smaller mirrorless systems with the EVA1 could be a really powerful shooting combo. I love this camera so much that I couldn't bring myself to sell it this year when I upgraded to the Komodo. I now regularly use the EVA1 and Komodo together, and I think they pair really well, and the image with a bit of work matches really easily in post. If you're worried about the Super 35 versus full frame debate, then, you know, I'd say a lot of this is largely marketing hype. You only need to look at Arri's latest release, the Alexa 35, to understand the importance or dominance of the Super 35 format in filmmaking. You know, I hate to say it, but there is also a real perception difference between turning up to a commercial shoot with a small mirrorless DSLR and turning up with a camera like the EVA1. You know, after getting the EVA1 as an owner-operator, I was able to charge much higher rates for my work than I was previously, and I was able to shoot on higher spec jobs. So if you do decide to pick up an EVA1, I can recommend 2 great Facebook groups that are super useful for general questions, advice, or for sharing work. Links for both of those will be in the description down below. Please, if you have any questions about this camera, feel free to drop them in the comments down below. If there are any EVA1 shooters out there that are watching this, I'd love to hear from you about your thoughts on this camera. Are you still shooting on this camera? Are you thinking of upgrading away from this camera? Let me know in the comments down below and I'll do my best to get back to you. But until next time, see ya!